Hi everyone, welcome to Close Reading Poetry. I'm Adam Walker, and today I'd like to address a question that I've gotten a few times in different iterations. What are my thoughts on the canon? Do I believe in a canon? Am I pro-canon? What are my thoughts on the canon? I've thought a lot about the canon over the past few years as a graduate student, and as one who is traditionally inclined, the idea of a canon of English literature is very appealing to me. And for a while I was pretty supportive of Harold Bloom's idea of the canon. And then it began to change. I came to a position that I think is more honest with myself, who I am as a reader, and with my own relationship to literature as it's developed over the past couple decades. And my position on the canon actually, I think, predates the 1980s and 1990s Canon Wars, and I'll talk a little bit about the Canon Wars. But it's based on different premises entirely. To give you a better idea of my position, let me start with a little survey of the history of the canon in English literature. Originally, canon refers to a standard or a set of scripture texts, religious texts, that involve the selection of canonical books that were agreed upon within this set of religious texts. When it comes to English literature, one is usually talking about a set of works that represent the best that has been thought or said in the world. And that's a phrase from Matthew Arnold, who will be important in this history. And who wouldn't be behind that, right? A list of the best things that have ever been written. But selecting that list is complex. It's complicated. So English literature was not always a discipline at the university. It rose as a discipline in the Victorian period in the late 1800s. It started in Scotland, moved to England, and moved to America, and so you had a lot of universities who were opening up English departments for the first time. Back then, there really wasn't an idea of the canon as we know it today. So Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet and critic, began promoting this idea of a canon. For Matthew Arnold, the centrality of the canon helped solidify a national identity, and it helped fill the void of religion. See, in the late 19th century, religious belief was challenged by scientific developments like Darwinism, technology, and also just a general lack of faith within the rise of modernity. This at least is the narrative that Matthew Arnold articulates, and he writes beautifully about it in his poem Dover Beach. Matthew Arnold sees literature as replacing religion's role as the ethical backbone of a nation. Literature for him would tell truths about human life in a way that scripture or religion told divine truths about human life. And so in a way, for Matthew Arnold, the formation of a canon is incredibly important. It is morally invested for him, and he sees a lot at stake in it. So literature for Arnold is valuable because it gives us these truths about human life. Fast forward to the early 20th century, where you have critics like F.R. Leavis, I.A. Richards, and many of the American close readers rising up in English departments and professionalizing the study of English literature. English literature at that time was a fledgling study. Critics were very eager to show their rigor, to say and to prove that English literature was up to snuff as any other respectable study, such as history or psychology. And so you have these critics developing a highly specialized vocabulary for ways of talking very intelligently about what's happening in poetry and how poetry works. This is good in some respects. On one hand, it's opening up this lexicon for seriously thinking about how poetry works. It's not all this mumbo-jumbo, touchy-feely stuff. No, we can actually identify what moves us and why it's important. As a close reader, I have great respect for the early 20th century close readers. But it also came with this very specialized vocabulary that actually prohibited public readers from accessing this discourse. And so F.R. Leavis and his circle, the American New Critics, developed a language that was very specialized. And F.R. Leavis, in this specialization, wanted to solidify a canon of literature, one that, like Arnold's vision, would support a national character and would enrich the culture. So Leavis is very concerned with Matthew Arnold about literature's role as enriching culture, as though it were its own religion. Now fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, where you have the culture wars. English departments, the academic study of literature has turned from close reading and textual analysis really to theoretical and ideological polemics. The premise in pedagogy, to me, seems to have shifted from the question, how do we enable English majors to think critically, write intelligently, and read deeply, to how do we now equip English majors to change society, to subvert oppressive structures? I think that both of these aims are noble. We should have a socially equitable vision, I think, driving whatever we do. But with this priority of criticizing oppressive structures, with that came the criticism of the canon, because the canon was exclusive, and it was largely male, and it was largely white, and so it needed to be removed. And this battle, this canon war, was more than just about which books were the best. It was really about how do we imagine a better society in the future. And the books we choose will depend upon what kind of society we want in the future. And so you have this very contentious battle in which many professors and scholars and critics were embroiled. Now let me talk about, am I pro-canon or anti-canon? I think there are two major pros to the canon, and I think there are two major cons to the canon. And one value of the canon is it provides a map for discovery. You have only so much time available to read in your life. Let's say 30 minutes a day, maybe an hour a day for a working class. That's expensive time. You want to know what to spend your time on, so you want to know what's the best that has been thought or said, what's the most moving piece, what's the most beautiful. You want to know that. If you've only got 30 minutes to spend, you want to read something good. So you go to the canon and you figure out what's the best. What would I enjoy most? So the canon provides a map for discovery. One of the cons or the dangers of the canon is that it can be exclusive. The canon weaponized as scripture, as something that cannot be changed, is dangerous because at times a measurement like that can evaluate lesser known figures based on their obscurity and not by their work. And I see this happen a lot. It does involve the exclusion of particular writers that deserve to be read. If you look at what might be called the canon today, there are many great critics, poets, and novelists who are not included in the canon, who are just simply forgotten about in the past 50 years. One of the greatest literary critics of the 18th century, I don't think has ever been anthologized. His name is Robert Louth. His lectures on the sacred poetry of the Hebrews are fantastic. I think he rivals Johnson as a critic, and I love Johnson, so that's high praise. And he's a close reader, Robert Louth. People don't read Robert Louth anymore. And you look at the poet, Edward Young, in his Night Thoughts. Beautiful poetry. Great example of 18th century command of verse and diction and just the dexterity of his imagery and his correctness. But Edward Young, no one's really reading him anymore, or his Night Thoughts. George MacDonald, a great Victorian critic. I read a lot of MacDonald. It's part of who I am as a reader, and I think his novels are fine. I think what he lacks in narrative sophistication, he makes up for in imagery, in rich illusion, and figures. So there are many poets, non-white poets, non-American or UK, European poets who are writing in English. Many people are outside the canon who should be read. And so that's one danger of the canon, is this exclusivity. One value, the second value of the canon, I think, is that it systematizes a study for literature. Now, if you go into an English major and you want to study English literature from a department because you want to study the best that has been thought or said, you may not actually get that in most American English departments. If you want to study the canon, becoming an English major is not always what you should do. That's not always going to get you a study of the canon. Even for the non-English major, for the public reader, it offers you a map, a template, a system of studying English literature, a hierarchy even though I don't agree with ranking poets. So that's a huge value. It's access. It provides a way in. Without it, people are left standing at the door wondering, well, it looks like a nice building, but I can't get inside. Don't have a brochure. I need a map. Well, the canon is that map. Once you go inside, figure out what to do with the map later. You might not want it. You might find something. You might find one corner of the asp over here really interesting. Or these windows over there fascinating. Or maybe you don't like the look of the pews here. But something in this building is going to speak to you. And if you don't go in, if you don't start anywhere, then you'll never find that. And then fourth, the second danger of the canon, I think, is this professionalization that occurs with the academic study of literature. This ivory tower gatekeeping of the best that has been thought or said. During the rise of the professionalization of English literature in the 20s, 30s, 50s, and 60s, there were a group of scholars who were writing against it. C.S. Lewis was one of them. Helen Gardner was another one. Graham Huff was another one. And Helen Gardner, she wrote this excellent essay called The Scepter and the Torch. She said there are two kinds of critics these days. Those who wield the scepter, who are making the decisions, a very Harold Bloom-like character, but she was talking about F.R. Leavis and his clan, and close readers of the American academies who are wielding a scepter and making authoritative judgments. And then there are those who are the other kinds of critics who hold the torch, who just illuminate and show what there is to be seen. And she obviously much prefers the latter. C.S. Lewis says that literature is not, the use of it is not to tell us about life. The use of it is not to enrich culture. So Lewis, Gardner, Huff, they all shared this distaste for the professionalization. They thought that it wasn't facilitating people, it wasn't bringing people in. It was building a wall. And they didn't like the idea of the canon, or at least C.S. Lewis didn't. They thought that by evaluating literature in terms of a canon, it would prohibit people, like public readers, anyone who just reads for fun, it would prohibit people from making their own literary discoveries. The danger of close reading, the danger of this professionalization, the danger of the canon was that the critics were doing the work of the reader for him or her, and that was not what should happen. I totally agree with them on this point, and that's why I find my own views on the canon more in line with them, in saying that literature and reading exists for joy, enjoyment. C.S. Lewis, in his experiment on criticism, really excellent essay, I return to it every few years or so, he basically argues that literature exists not to enrich culture, not to promote a national identity, not to replace religion, not to teach us about life, although, it does these things. He says, the use of literature is enjoyment. You read, you surrender your imagination to it. You lay aside your prejudices, your expectations, and you surrender your mind and your spirit to it. And of course, you approach it with an open mind like this, and literature is going to yield its own beauties. And the reader will find the meaning in it. The meaning will come. The beauty will come, even if the meaning does not. How often does that happen to me? And enjoyment is the end in itself. When you have this imaginative encounter with a poem, when it's resonating with your soul, and inside there's this strange vibration happening between you and the poem, and it's putting in words things that you never thought could be put into words. And it's opening up new worlds, and it's creating this sensation of discovery and illumination. That's the value of literature. And so when it comes to a canon, I think that everyone should create their own canon. I don't believe in the canon. I think that everyone should use the canon as a map into literature, and then abandon the canon when they find it useful to do so. Some of my most beloved poets are not canonical, and yours might not be either. But everyone should compose a list of those poems that have had real meaning, real enduring value, even if you can't explain why, but somehow you know it's true. These poems, these pictures, these media that resonate with us and speak to us and have in some way become a part of us and have become our own utterances. This I think is much more valuable, being able to understand and identify those texts. You understand yourself that way and building your own canon. So in a future video, I think the next video I make on the canon will be about how to build your own canon. So I hope this gives you some ideas about my own thoughts on the canon and what I'm doing here on this channel. Let me know what you think. I'm curious what other people who have wrestled with this idea of the canon, where they've ended up and where they're going, and what they think. So please do let me know. And thanks for taking an interest. Thanks for the question. And until next time.